Um, Hello, everyone. Quick intro. I run Filter, which is an online publication that covers drugs, drug policy, and human rights through a harm reduction lens, and that integrates tobacco harm reduction into that wider coverage. As Suli mentioned, my talk is perhaps overambitiously titled Uniting the Harm Reduction Movements. I'm going to approach it by just asking myself and attempting to answer four questions. Question one, why should people in tobacco harm reduction care about integrating with the wider drugs harm reduction movement? I hope you won't need too much convincing, but a few points are drugs harm reduction is really big. In the US alone, we're talking hundreds of thousands of followers and supporters of major and minor organizations, and you can obviously multiply that around the world. And these aren't just any old people. These are people who are highly engaged and motivated to campaign, to engage in protests, lobbying, direct action. And the movement is also effective. It can claim credit for strings of legislative successes around the world, ranging from the spread of cannabis legalization to syringe exchange to naloxone distribution and much, much more. And of course, in many jurisdictions around the world, sadly and shamefully not in the United States, we have consumption rooms where people can go and use drugs like heroin in safer settings without fear of legal persecution. And I think the achievement of something like that, which could be viewed as so taboo, shines a very optimistic light on prospects for the tobacco harm reduction movement. So there are great learning opportunities. I heard David Sweena express yesterday just how much he learned from studying the harm reduction response to the AIDS crisis and how applicable many of those strategies are. And I think that there's just a sort of a natural bond between the new movements, as Harry Shapiro was talking about yesterday. Both movements were created from the bottom up by directly impacted people who were often widely despised in society, but who took control and empowered themselves and their peers to improve their own health. I think that's important to remember. Question two, what is the current relationship like between tobacco harm reduction and drugs harm reduction? I mean, I think we all know it could be and should be a lot better. Frankly, there is still a lot of silence and segregation and suspicion between the two. There's much too little crossover. As one personal example, in April, I was at the International Harm Reduction Conference in Porto with over 1,200 delegates, and now I'm here, at least I think I am. And I think an unscientific guess would be that there's perhaps 15 or 20 people that were present at both events, and certainly not nearly as many as there should be, given shared affinity and goals. I've also attended many major harm reduction conferences in the US, again, 1,000 plus delegates, typically involving many dozens of panels and sessions, and THR is just widely ignored and sidelined at those events. It's very typical for there, perhaps, Helen knows this, to be just sort of maybe one side event dealing with tobacco harm reduction, or equally typically nothing at all. And that's clearly not satisfactory. And there's just a lot of silence. Numerous major drugs harm reduction organizations don't even have an official position or policy on vaping or tobacco harm reduction. And running Filter, this is something I experience. I get reporters to ring up these organizations and ask for quotes on this subject, and we often just get no response. And yeah, also running Filter, we just notice anecdotally a lot of segregation and siloing in the stories we publish, whereby some people on social media will only respond to tobacco harm reduction stories and others will only respond to drugs stories, and there's limited crossover. Question three, why does this difficult relationship exist? There are lots of reasons. I think one of them that comes high up is attitudes to capitalism. Drugs harm reduction is overwhelmingly a left-wing movement with a lot of anti-capitalist sympathies, and there's no doubt that to many people in that movement, the notion that companies, including tobacco companies, are making big profits, it sits very uncomfortably. I remember Ethan Nadelman, who former long-time leader of Drug Policy Alliance, telling me once that there are some people in our movement who think it's more important to punish tobacco companies than to protect public health. There's also the question of turf, just a general feeling that the more sort of natural role of harm reduction concerns the edgier area of illegal drugs, drugs for which people are arrested and imprisoned and persecuted along racist lines, drugs that can kill instantly rather than in the long term. And dedicated funding streams are also a factor. But I think too often, if we're looking to engage a drugs harm reduction audience, and particularly in the US, people sometimes deploy unsuitable arguments. We see a lot of arguments in the US that are perceived to be right-leaning, like individual liberty, consumer choice, the right to buy and sell what you like. I don't disagree with those principles, but they can be ineffective talking points if you're looking to engage a drugs harm reduction audience. And on that note, the messenger matters too. It's great to see so many people from such diverse backgrounds all over the world at this conference. There is, I think, a perception within drugs harm reduction that the tobacco harm reduction movement is still maybe too dominated by people who are white or male or wearing suits. At least I only fit into two of those categories. And my final question to myself is, how can we improve this relationship? Well, an obvious but very important one is communicate. We need more dialogue between the two movements. We need to create more shared platforms for mutual discovery. Filter exists to be one such platform. Mutual invitations to events and trainings are very important too. I'm really encouraged that I've heard this exact relationship being discussed already many times at this conference. Yesterday I heard the Swedish tobacco harm reduction advocate Atakan Befritz talk about how just in April, for the very first time, he had the opportunity to attend the International Harm Reduction Conference. He described it as amazing when everybody gets to talk to everyone else. Well, shouldn't that be an obvious and routine thing? But it's not just about talking, it's also about creating combined services in the way that some of my colleagues here and elsewhere have already been doing. We know that people who use illegal drugs or who struggle with alcohol, for example, smoke at far higher rates than the general population. Why shouldn't it be routine that vaping products, for example, are handed out at methadone clinics or syringe exchanges? There's a perfect synergy there to be explored if we could only get our act together. But to do that, it's important, I think, to use tailored arguments for tobacco harm reduction when addressing a drugs harm reduction audience. Social justice arguments are the ones that are going to particularly play very well. And if we front load how tobacco smoking-related harms devastate marginalized populations, low-income communities, minorities, people with mental health diagnoses, incarcerated people, LGBTQ people, people who are homeless, and so on, then we drive home that tobacco harm reduction, among many other things, is about health equity, and it is a social justice cause, and we need to do more of that and communicate it better. Part of that, of course, as I mentioned, is deploying the right messengers. We need messengers whose politics and demographics are suitable for the audience that we're trying to address. We need to hear directly from people within the marginalized communities we're talking about, because their stories are the ones that are going to move and convince a drugs harm reduction audience. And there are many parallels that you can draw that could be useful. For example, when it comes to industry, it's also true that people in the drugs harm reduction movement don't like, for example, the pharma companies that make Suboxone, and yet it doesn't stop them from advocating passionately for the availability of buprenorphine. So we're not going to remove the dislike of big companies, but we can outweigh it with more important concerns. I'll end by just saying that I do see signs of encouraging progress in uniting these movements. I do believe that the roots and beliefs and emphasis on evidence that the movements share will naturally draw them together, but by focusing on it and working explicitly towards it, I think we can make it happen faster for everyone's benefit. Thank you.